Welcome to Mokena's Front Porch, a Mokena history podcast with Matt Galik and hosted by me, Israel Smith. On April 15th, 1923, St. John's German Evangelical Church, a church of about 170 members, dedicated their brand new building that they'd spent years building and planning. On Sunday, October 2nd, 2022, St. John's celebrated the 100-year anniversary by opening two time capsules that had been buried with the cornerstone of the building, one from 1987 and one from 1922. As a gift to the St. John's family and to the community, Matt wrote a 12-page book detailing the history of St. John's, as well as the difficult process they went through in building the church. St. John's is one of my favorite buildings in Mokena. It's one of my favorite places to stop on a late-night walk around downtown. Reading through Matt's book gave me a greater understanding and appreciation for the St. John's building and the St. John's Church. So sit back and relax and enjoy this next episode of Mokena's Front Porch. Hey Matt, welcome back.
Thanks, Israel. Glad to be back.
And today we're talking about St. John's.
Yes.
Which you're very familiar with.
I am, yes.
Is it true that you went to preschool at St. John's?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Many, many years ago, I went to preschool at St. John's, and my teacher back then, Mrs. Pam Schoenweiss, is still there.
Wow.
And we still bump into each other. And so she's still around. I'm not sure if she's teaching there anymore, but the preschool still exists. But yeah, it is true that I went there. Yeah.
So not to give away your age, but what year would that have been? Preschool.
Let's see. That would have been, I figured this out once. That would have been 1991. Oh, let's see. Yeah, 1991.
Okay.
When I was there.
And what's looking at the church now? How do you think it'd be different from when you were in preschool?
Wow, good question. I'm not really sure. I think the preschool's about the same size, and when I'm in the school today from time to time, it doesn't really look too much different. It really matches my memories a lot. And the actual room, I still remember actually which room I had. It still also looks a lot alike. But I'm sure the congregation has grown a little bit over the years.
The community center was still there at that time?
Oh, good question. The community center was not there. In fact, the whole area around St. John's looked completely different. So where the community center is now, St. John's Christian Community Center, they call it, back in those days, St. John's Annex was still there, which had formerly been the Methodist Church. Let's see, St. John's, without having my files in front of me, I believe St. John's bought that building from the Methodists probably like early 1980s. And then they kind of made it just sort of like a meeting place. And basically what they use the community center for nowadays is what they use the annex for. And like elections would be held there. And
sure. We had a Boy Scout spaghetti dinner this past weekend there.
That is correct. Absolutely. Yeah.
Good.
Definitely.
Well, it was exciting to see the kind of the 100-year celebration of the church and that. And
it was very cool.
Going through the book that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
Oh, thanks.
The building is beautiful.
It is. Yeah. It's a favorite of mine.
Absolutely. Mine too.
Yeah.
So
I'm
excited for you to share this story with us.
Great. Yeah. I'm excited to share it.
Let's get into it.
Sounds good. Not much weathers the test of time to celebrate a centennial. Organizations flourish and decline while buildings come and go. However, in Mokena, a select few have had the honor to grace our landscape and community for a century or more. Standing like in elite society, these places hold watch over our town and are as familiar as the faces of dear loved ones. We live in exalted times, as 2022 marks the 100th year of St. John's United Church of Christ gracing 2nd Street. She's Mokena's stateliest landmark, with a proud bell tower in red brick eminence that is one of the highest places in town. She even greets the visitor to the village as soon as one disembarks from a city train, with Mokena Street leading straight to her door. In order to understand where the St. John's community was 100 years ago, we first have to turn back the hands of time even further. Pious German and Swiss families of evangelic faith began meeting informally as early as 1855, in which their spiritual needs were served by itinerant country preachers. At this early, distant point in our narrative, Mokena was a young stop and trading post on the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad, composed of a train depot, a steam-powered sawmill, a handful of businesses, and few houses in a verdant agricultural region. As the little town grew bit by bit, this group of the faithful passed the Constitution and organized themselves into a proper congregation on March 1st, 1862. A date not without consequence, as our land was nearly a year into its Civil War, and souls were heavy in our young community. Thus, that winter, they were born to the world as the German United Evangelical St. John's Church, under the guiding wing of Prussian-born Reverend Wilhelm Meyer. Previously meeting in the village's small schoolhouse, their congregation secured a tract of land a few rods southeast thereof on Mokena's public square, a space set aside solely for educational and church buildings by Allen Denny, our town's founder. Working together, the congregants of St. John's themselves raised the timbers of the first church they could call their own at the northwest corner of today's 2nd and Union Streets. When all was said and done and the dust had settled, the new wooden sanctuary measured in at 50 feet long by 30 feet wide, with a handsome steeple and a total cost of $1,500. The St. John's family rejoiced on September 20th, 1862, as their church was dedicated to God. This first church was the scene of countless christenings, confirmations, marriages, and funerals, holding untold emotions of love and loss within its four walls. 6 pastors took charge of the pulpit until the First World War, leading the flock through times of levity and days of heartache. The families of the founding mothers and fathers of the congregation slowly expanded over the years, presenting a challenge that only grew over time. With each passing decade, it became clear that the old wooden church was getting too small. As early as 1912, the St. John's family was weighing building a new sanctuary. Under Reverend G.H. Sieveking, they mulled whether they should simply remodel the old place, which would include putting a basement and furnace under it for central heating, or starting anew with a contemporary place of worship. In any case, the older St. John's members were against a new church, while the younger ones were gung-ho on construction, who, with a concerned mien, noted that Mokena was noted among surrounding communities for being behind the times. It was reckoned that remodeling the church then in use would cost at least $2,500, while starting fresh could easily cost $6,000 or so. A later calculation came out much higher, estimating that it could be as much as $22,000. The young members were pushing a subscription drive where shares could be sold for $100 apiece. The question went back and forth, and ultimately it was decided that any new construction should be done later. The matter cropped up again at New Year's 1914, with Reverend Sieveking still at the helm. On January 2nd, the annual business meeting of St. John's was held, and the proverbial football was tossed around again. The Betania Verein pitched the idea of adding on to the church to make extra space for the pipe organ, thus making more room in the sanctuary proper. Talks went on, and the logistics of physically raising the church were laid out. Everything was ultimately voted down, with 21 members being against, with only 9 for. In the annals of St. John's history, as well as Mokena's at large, perhaps no other figure can be more rightfully called the builder than Reverend William Kreis. Possessed of a fascinating life before he ever set foot in our village, Kreis was born August 4th, 1874, in the Silesian village of Stoiberwitz, in the southeast corner of the contemporary Prussian Empire, which, after the years of war and shifting European borders in the 20th century, became a part of Poland. As a youth, he underwent thorough religious training and first set foot on American soil as a guest to Chicago's Columbian Exposition in 1893. 4 years later, he began a course of study at Eden Theological Seminary in St. Louis, whereupon he was ordained in the summer of 1900. The newly minted pastor's favorite biblical verse was 1 Corinthians 15:58. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. The autumn of his ordination, William Kreis was wed to Marie Amelia Freitag, who in time welcomed son Arthur and daughter Elfrida to their home, as well as taking in young Herta and Elois Peschera, who retreated as members of the family. Reverend Kreis resided in Donaldson, Ohio, when he received the call to pastorate from Mokena, and took up the mantle at St. John's on August 26, 1917. His arrival at the head of the flock was a burst of sunlight on their horizon. No sooner had Reverend Kreis and his family set down roots than the St. John's Brotherhood was founded, a men's group that came to hold a place of leadership in the congregation, while the Reverend also inaugurated Forward, a flavorful little church publication, all the while continuing to hold services alternately in German and English. A staunch supporter of American doughboys during the First World War, and one of Mokena's most patriotic residents, he had a large American flag hung from his pulpit in the church, declaring that it would stay as long as the war continued. The year the conflict ended, the name of the congregation also changed, it now being christened St. John's German Evangelical Church. Reverend Kreis flourished as a leader, and under his shepherding, everything from the attendance of Sunday school to the size of the congregation itself grew 200% under his watch. Acutely feeling their cramped quarters in these years, it would plainly and modestly be said by a member of the flock that our church work has been hampered by crowded quarters and limited equipment. The arrival of Reverend William Kreis in Mokena kicked the building issue back to the forefront. A big step forward was taken under Reverend Kreis's leadership on February 3, 1919, when a building fund for the new church was inaugurated. A few weeks later, on March 4th, St. John's Brotherhood, with the help of the Ladies' Aid Society, put on a dinner at Front Street's Mokena Hall for the purpose of raising the first funds. The weather that night was stormy and less than optimal, but the turnout was grand and about $100 came into the coffers, with cakes being sold as high as $2 apiece. When the Brotherhood next met on April 7th, the outlook was good, but still held with a healthy amount of caution. Reverend Kreis explained the need for the new sanctuary, but as it still remained to be seen if anywhere near the full amount of money could be saved for one, the addition and basement plan would be reverted back to if all else failed. More number crunching was done, and the conservative amount of $20,000 was arrived at. It was decided by the Brotherhood that pledges would be taken up, and once 3/4 of the final amount was raised, ground would be broken. The flock steamed ahead with their goal, and in the balmy summer of 1919, the church's Ladies' Aid Society gave a huge gift to the building fund.
So this is the first that we're hearing of the St. John's Brotherhood?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And they seem to have a huge part in the church as well as the building of the new building.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And any idea, are they still around? Is that...
Unfortunately, the Brotherhood is not still around, although they existed for a pretty long time. Without having my collection of stuff, documents, what have you, in front of me, I'm not sure exactly when they officially ceased existence or went out of existence, but they were still going strong even in the 1930s and 40s.
Oh, wow.
So, they continued along.
And also we had the first mention of the Ladies' Aid Society.
Mm-hmm. The Ladies' Aid, yeah, they were just as what do I want to say, influential in church affairs and in supporting the church as the Brotherhood was. It was interesting. For many years, they were known by their German name, which was the Frauenverein, which just means ladies' society.
Sounds very nice.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely. Yeah, definitely. And then they kind of took up the name Ladies' Aid Society a little later once English started to be used more in the church. And the Ladies' Aid was actually still around, I'm pretty sure, all the way up into the 2000s.
Wow.
Although, like the Brotherhood, they also no longer exist. I'm sure one of our St. John's listeners could correct me on this, but I think they may have been folded into some other church organization at some point.
And Reverend Kreis it's the first time we're hearing of him, and it starts to really show the huge impact that he had.
Absolutely.
I mean, the nickname "the Builder" says a lot.
Yeah. That's one I kind of bestowed on him myself there, but I think he really deserves it because he came to Mokena with this sort of like can-do, go-getter spirit that really changed things.
Clearly, 200% church growth is incredible. I mean, for any size congregation, that's amazing.
Absolutely.
It looks like the ladies. The last thing you talk about is this $1,000 donation by the Ladies' Aid Society.
Yeah,
and with that, it seemed to really kick off the building of the building.
Yeah, that pretty much got things rolling right there.
Okay, yeah, let's get back into it.
Sounds good. As 1920 rang in, our hometown newspaper, the News Bulletin, described the plans of the St. John's family as beginning to look like reality. For after the newly formed building committee had visited some churches in Chicago and Danville, they dreamed of loftier plans and were inspired to raise their goal for twice the original amount, this time for a whopping $40,000 edifice. The challenge was big, but as Mokenians are known for their generous nature, money was pouring in. In early February, Reverend Kreis proudly stated that $20,000 had already been pledged, and that the future construction was the all-engrossing topic of the St. John's Evangelical congregation. Everyone is vitally interested in the movement. 3 years later, this time would be remembered as a flurry of activity. It was wearily recalled that few outsiders will realize what a volume of work had to be done by the committee and subcommittees before the first spade could be turned. Session after session was held. Each one extended close onto the midnight hour. Obstacles have been surmounted that seemed insurmountable, and critical periods have been bridged over until the solution of the particular problem was reached. At this time, the building committee was made up of 17 representative gentlemen of the congregation. Among them were chairman and local hardware store owner William Niethammer, farmhand August Brown, concrete contractor Julius G. Oswald, and livestock buyer Emil Kropp. Their gears were turning, but as of yet, they still had yet to choose a site for the new church. Fundraising sallied forth, and it wasn't always a boring chore. On February 17, 1920, another event took place in Mokena Hall, this time when an auction of boxes filled with delicacies was held under the auspices of the Brotherhood. Local auctioneer Herbert Moriarty hypnotized old and young with his sales calls. The News Bulletin devoted their front page of that week's paper to covering the event, which noted that music and money jingled at the social, and that good cheer and a feeling of brotherly affection seemed to prevail. The bidding was spirited, and the paper proudly, yet saucily, wrote that purses that had never even seen daylight were produced and pried open. Even the preacher was seen to smile, so good was the sight to look upon. The auction was a hit, and when all was said and done, an amazing $509 was collected for the building fund. Not bad, considering that each box's opening bid was $5. As anyone familiar with a construction project knows, no detail is ever set in stone. After some preliminary plans for the new church were drawn up by an architect from Danville, the final price crept higher to $50,000, but the St. John's family was undaunted. At the end of spring 1920, the congregation cast a ballot as to whether the undertaking should continue, and it was a resounding yes. The work of raising money hummed along in earnest, with a handsome sum being taken in at a big picnic put on by the tireless workers of the Brotherhood and the Ladies' Aid Society in early July. Held amongst the shady trees of Copple Grove on the site of today's Woodland Circle, hundreds attended the soiree that took place from afternoon into the evening. Aside from our village's folk, guests were counted from Frankfort, Joliet, Piatone, and even Moni. Races and sports were held, as was a calf auction, which was deemed by the News Bulletin the most exciting part of the afternoon program. Valentine H. Scher of Tinley Park won the calf, but he donated it back to St. John's, who turned around and sold it again to Fred Junker of Orland for $39.50. At the end of the day, the building fund found itself $1,100 richer. With the events having been held thus far, a tidy purse of money had been raised, but the congregation still looked back over the previous 16 months and considered it a rather quiet time. On October 1st, 1920, the news bulletin stated that this fall will witness the launching of the biggest church drive which this section has ever seen. The various committees of the St. John Evangelical Church are teeming with activity for the big work which is ahead for the fall and winter campaign in the interest of the new $50,000 church. The campaign about to be launched will be a systematic and thorough-worked affair. Calendars were marked to start the new drive on October 17th and to wrap things up that Halloween. It was optimistically hoped that the first shovelful of dirt would be lifted in 1921. A committee of 49 congregants, men and women both, was tasked to gather subscriptions in a house-to-house canvass of the village. For the subscribers' ease, the full amount pledged could be taken up front or made in installments. By the end of their rounds, which were extended to account for an influx of last-minute donors, the committee counted $31,000 to their name, with this and past drives to their credit. More money was also due, with the St. John's congregation expecting an additional $4,000 to come in soon. It turned out that their dollars would go even further than expected, as that fall of 1920, the cost in building materials dropped. The estimated total price of the new edifice now fell to around $45,000. To track their progress, a large electric cross was set up in the old St. John's sanctuary, the notion being that for every $50 pledged, a gold star would light up on it. It was noted that the cross was prettily illuminated with various colored light bulbs. A vision for the new church was starting to take form. In the words of the news bulletin, it is planned to make this church the community center in the truest sense of the word. A basement for social activities was planned that could hold 500 people, with political meetings, bazaars, church entertainments, dairymen meetings, etc. in mind, with all Mokenians being invited to use the space, irregardless of religious persuasion. However, it almost went without saying that theatrical performances and dances will be barred, or any gathering that is detrimental to the welfare of the youth of the community. A banner moment in the history of St. John's German Evangelical Church came to pass on January 3rd, 1921, for on this day, a resolution was passed green-lighting the building committee to begin construction. A splendid site for the new sanctuary had been selected at the head of Mokena Street, a few yards to the west of the church then in use, just past the Methodist Church, St. John's long-standing neighbor of more than half a century. The large lot had been purchased by the congregation the previous August for the handsome price of $4,000. However, before the first inch of ground could be broken, a nettlesome problem had to be solved. Namely, the place chosen for the new church already had a building on it, and a substantial one at that. The 2-story, 14-room house of former Mokena Mayor Noble Jones had stood there for decades, having been lately occupied by the Brinkerhoff and Lockwood families. Also on the lot stood a 20 by 30-foot barn with an attached coal and woodshed. After the building committee had acquired the property, they auctioned off the house and barn on February 3, 1921, to Elmer Woodcock for $1,300. Before the Frankfurt farmer moved the princely house to his acreage near our sister city, he sold the north wing to August Hench, who had it detached and dragged a short distance to remain in Mokena. As the weeks and months passed, the souls of St. John's grew happier and more confident with each passing day. The always turning wheels of fundraising never slept, and in March 1922, the church's True Blue Sunday School class was active selling small paper bricks at 10 cents each to bolster the building fund. Miss Ruth Niethammer supplied the paper, which were fashioned into bricks at Mokena's News Bulletin office on Front Street. All was moving along according to plan. Around this time, Leonard F.W. Stuba and Company of Danville were secured as the new church's architect, who completed a plan for an edifice in the English Gothic style, fashioned from brick and stately Bedford stone. As a feather in Mokena's cap, the new sanctuary would be heated with vapor steam, which heretofore had not been in use in the village. On Wednesday, March 15, 1922, the building committee convened at the church parsonage on 3rd Street to open the bids it had received from 8 different builders. A representative of each firm was on hand for the big moment, with the gentleman having traveled from Chicago, Chicago Heights, Danville, Kansas, Illinois, Sullivan, and Peatone. The contract was awarded to J.W. Montgomery of Sidell in East Central Illinois, who turned in a bid for $37,600, coming in at substantially less than the originally projected price.
So it started off, and they start talking, and they're $6,000, I think, is the initial thought, and then that revised up to $20,000 in 1919. And then in 1920, it goes up to $40,000. The paper thought it'd be a $50,000 church. Then we start seeing it drop down to $45,000 and then $37,600. So that's a pretty wide variance.
Kind of went all over the place. Yeah.
But $37,600 was about $665,000 in today's money.
Yeah, that's
so for a small town church. That's really a significant task that they're taking on.
Yeah, it was quite the undertaking, and somehow they made it.
Well, it's exciting to see and to realize the passion in the community and the passion in the church members that it took, especially at that time, to raise that much money.
Absolutely. They went at it with all their hearts, to put it mildly. Spring had dawned in Mokena, and on April 18th, 1922, the men of the building committee staked out the dimensions for the new church's foundation on the former Jones lot, all in all measuring 72 by 86 feet. The next day, the first ground was broken. As excavation for the basement started in earnest, Reverend William Kreis penned an open letter to the village. Under the heading, "To the dear people of Mokena and community," he wrote an essay beaming with pride for Mokena, saying, "The citizens of Mokena can pride themselves on the fact that they live in as clean a little city as any town of its size in the glorious state of Illinois," before going on to shine for his flock, the money raised for the new church, and looking happily to us in the future. The church has been planned carefully to meet modern needs. It will be a real home-like church and will contribute to the lives and welfare of every one of you. For while the main auditorium will be kept sacred to the purpose of preaching and teaching the word, ample provisions have been made for community needs, such as lectures, entertainments, recreation, social life, athletics, reading, banquets, educational or uplift meetings, anything and everything which the church conscience approves as making for the betterment of the moral, social, and religious life of the community. Every dollar given towards the construction of this building will be earning compound interest a century hence. Let everyone do their bit, and let us show the spirit of goodwill and brotherly love. Here is a grand opportunity for all. Come on, folks. Let us erect the home for God's work. Boost it. Help it. Be enthusiastic about it. At the same time, Pastor Kreis called upon his Sunday school students to skip buying ice cream, candy, sodas, etc. that coming summer, and instead to give the money to the building fund. The news bulletin reported that he has pointed out that by so doing, the scholars will be laying up treasures in heaven. After years of fundraising and planning, what had heretofore seemed like a buoyant dream had become reality when in that April of 1922, 9 railroad carloads of brick arrived in Mokena to begin the construction of the new St. John's German Evangelical Church. The congregation was delighted at the groundbreaking ceremony, which was held that April 19th. The initial construction didn't go off without any hiccups, when at the end of May, the head and hand of a worker were injured when part of a derrick fell on him. Nevertheless, the work was progressing so nicely that the calendar was set to lay the cornerstone for the new structure on June 18th, 1922. That spring, President Warren G. Harding sat in the White House, and the Lincoln Memorial would be dedicated just a little over a month later. Later that year, King Tut's tomb would be discovered in Egypt's Valley of the Kings. The Mokena of 1922 would be unrecognizable to modern eyes. It was dairy territory, with picturesque farms dotting the landscape. In those days, Wolf Road, or Marty Lane, as it was usually called, was a narrow path that was muddy and impassable at times. A big steel water tower stood vigilant behind the town's village hall, fire department, and jail, all housed in the same small building. Our population stood at right about 500 residents, with business houses such as L. Brown's blacksmith shop, George Wanamaker's soft drink parlor lined up on Front Street, and the Cooper and Hastert Ford agency tucked away in a small building on First Street. On that glorious day of June 18th, 1922, the residents of Mokena, whose parents and grandparents had been the founders of the St. John's flock exactly 60 years before, could scarcely remember a grander moment in the history of the village. The turnout for the cornerstone laying ceremony was immense, with hundreds counted. Visitors came not just from the village, but from many of the neighboring communities to boot. Covering the day's events on the front page of that week's edition, the news bulletin reported, "The weather being ideal, the people came in autos, by train, and even horse and buggy." The St. John's family and their visitors came together in the historic Old Church, where at 2 o'clock, Reverend G. Lambrecht of St. Peter's Evangelical Church of Frankfurt preached a lengthy sermon in German. In the words of the news bulletin, he pointed out that only with the Spirit of the Lord in the hearts of the congregation can the new edifice be the success it should be to the glory of God. He showed that as the heaven of heavens cannot contain the Spirit of God, no edifice built by human hands could contain the Spirit. But having the right spirit among themselves, the congregation could glorify and praise God in the temple where his glory dwelleth. Next, Reverend W. E. Oerland of Blue Island took to the pulpit, and in English went over many of the same points as his predecessor. Referring to the new church's construction, he told those in attendance that they should not ask, "What is it going to cost me?" but rather, "How much am I privileged to give?" After some musical selections given by the choir, the congregation made their way en masse to the half-built new church, led by Mokenian Frank Hirsch Jr.'s band. Reverend E. Palmer, pastor of the neighboring Mokena Methodist Church, offered a prayer, and Hirsch's band went on to strike up a few more pieces, in lieu of St. Peter's male quartet, who had been scheduled for the day, but in a last-minute change of plans, had been unable to attend. Reverend Kreis and the members of the building committee took to some scaffolding in the corner of the partially built edifice and assembled around a copper box that had been a donation of the Mokena Hardware Company. They placed inside it items such as an evangelical hymnal, a Bible, a program from the event printed in German and English, a 1922 issue of Der Friedensbote, a publication of the German Evangelical Synod of North America, along with other items selected by the pastor's daughter Elfrieda and her best friend Wandida Oswald. The box was then sealed into the wall above the white marble cornerstone, itself a gift of the Wunderlich Granite Company of Joliet. Each visiting pastor and all the men of the building committee came to the stone and recited a verse of scripture while tapping it with a gavel. Also there was Reverend Henry W. Freitag, who was not only the oldest pastor in the Evangelical Synod of Northern Illinois, but also Reverend Kreis's father-in-law. After all was said and done, about 140 of those who had taken part in the ceremony adjourned to Mokena's Hatch Hall, where a bountiful spread was waiting for them, all taken care of by the ladies of the church under the direction of Mrs. Selma Kropp. Clear progress in the construction continued to be seen. On the morning of Wednesday, September 6, 1922, the old bell of St. John's, which had pealed over Mokena countless times over the decades, was gently dismantled from its home in the wooden belfry of the old church and moved to its new home in the stately brick tower that by this point had risen substantially over the village to its height of 60 feet. At the same time, the worksite was proving to be a somewhat dangerous one. Listing the casualties like a battlefield report, the news bulletin reported, "A carpenter sawed his hand, and a piece of brick fell on the head of Elmer Schenek, knocking him down but not seriously injuring him. Another man mashed his thumb." As fall came around, the plasterers for the church's walls were on the scene, and in early October, the red asbestos shingle roof was being finished. On the crisp winter day of Tuesday, January 2nd, 1923, a congregational meeting with 34 members was held. After routine business was transacted, the group went on a tour of the new church, where work was still being carried out. The art glass windows were shipped and on their way, while the radiators and pews had just arrived and were being installed. Another important move was completed out of the old church at the end of February, when the pipe organ made its way into the new edifice. The St. John's family continued to help in ways that they could. Congregation member Mrs. Emma Beckstein quietly paid for the church's indoor plumbing out of her own pocket. A true Mokenian of humble ways, she didn't seek any recognition for her good deed. and public knowledge of her generous donation only came about after she passed away 5 years later. Another member of the flock with generosity in her heart was Mrs. Bertha Laufer, who in this era gave the painting Christ the Good Shepherd, which to this day still stands west of the altar. The complete furniture, altar coverings, carpets, and equipment of the dining room and kitchen were taken care of by the ladies of the congregation. So it was that after 4 years of planning, toil, and construction, the brand new St. John's German Evangelical Church was ready to be dedicated with pomp and circumstance. The date was set for Sunday, April 15th, 1923, and in heralding the upcoming day, the news bulletin got straight to the point, calling it the most important event which has ever taken place in the village of Mokena, either in church circles or in civic life. In taking advantage of the joyous occasion, it only made sense to celebrate another one too, namely the church's 60th Jubilee. Under an invitation to all of Mokena and the surrounding area, Reverend Kreis wrote, "It gives me great pleasure to be able to announce to you that now we are ready to dedicate to the service of the Triune God our new house of worship. After much planning, praying, and laboring, our new church stands ready to open its portals to the young and old, the happy and heavy laden, the weak and the strong. It stands ready to serve them all." 3 services were on the schedule for that Sunday, one each in the morning, afternoon, and evening, and the morning service was where the brunt of activity happened. The ribbon cutting for the new sanctuary was very similar to that of the cornerstone, mirroring the earlier proceedings in that there were sermons by multiple pastors, singing, and piousness. At 10 o'clock that Sunday morning, the St. John's family came together in their old church for the German-spoken Abschiedsfeier, or farewell service. Reverend Franz Bosold of Mannheim officiated, who had worn the mantle at St. John's from 1914 to 1917. After the song Unseren Ausgang segne Gott, or God Bless Our Departure, the flock again marched the few yards to the brand new church, which was ready to receive them with open arms. The weather that morning was less than optimal, but nevertheless droves of the faithful turned out with love in their hearts, with guests not only from Mokena and Frankfurt, but also from Blue Island, Joliet, Madison, and even Chicago. At the end of the day, it would be estimated that several thousand people had descended upon Mokena for the events. At the main portal of the new church, Reverend Kreis read Psalm 122. "I rejoiced with those who said to me, 'Let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet are standing in your gates, Jerusalem.'" Thus, the new home for the 170 members of St. John's German Evangelical Church was opened. When the doors were thrown open to the flock for the first time, they were undoubtedly impressed by what their eyes beheld. A gray sand finish was applied to the interior, with all woodwork being of white oak stained dark. Altogether, the main sanctuary and balcony had space. On the main floor, they would have found Reverend Kreis's study as well as a mother's restroom. The basement was a true multi-purpose area with classrooms, a kitchen, cloakrooms, the heating plant, and a stage. The church was also fully electrified. Reverend Kreis's father-in-law, Reverend Henry W. Freitag, was once again on hand and offered the prelude in the new edifice, followed by Reverend Kreis's prayer of dedication. St. John's Choir was joined by the choir of St. John's in Naperville in the song "Serve the Lord with Gladness," after which 2 visiting pastors preached. At noon, it was time to eat lunch, and at the church, the Ladies' Aid served 600 guests. Offerings were given at the noon meal and a later one in the evening, and between those and the donations given at the 3 services that Sunday, $1,500 was taken into St. John's coffers. The setting of the cornerstone and the dedication of the sanctuary had come and passed, and at the end of the day, the total cost of the new construction came out to $60,000, 2/3 of which had been taken in by pledges and donations. Nothing to sneeze at for a small Midwestern town of around 500 people. At the end of the story, it would be remiss not to address the subject of the church the flock had just left and its ultimate fate. Comfortably ensconced in the new sanctuary and taking care of loose ends after construction, the St. John's Board of Trustees moved to sell the old one that had been in use since the Civil War. Around New Year's 1925, enter Milton and Roy Kropp, the proprietors of Front Street's Mokena Hardware Company, who at this time became the new owners of the old edifice. Their lineage was rich with St. John's history, with their paternal grandparents having been among the church's founders in 1862, and their maternal grandfather being none other than Reverend Carl Schaub, who manned the pulpit at the church from 1873 to the end of 1906, a record for longevity that still stands to this day. The enterprising brothers decided to move the church to an empty lot just north of their hardware store and convert it into a duplex. In changing from a house of worship to a private residence, the historic landmark went through a metamorphosis, losing all the details that made it recognizable as a church, while still retaining its basic shape. In covering the move, the News Bulletin printed a piece that almost read like an obituary, but heralded its rebirth and ended on a peppy, sunny note. Considering the former church's age, the paper proudly wrote, "Barring fire or storm, this building can be of service for 62 years or more, as it would be hard to place it with equally as good as material today. Our forefathers would be proud to know that the former church is still standing, nearly a century after its relocation, as sturdy now as the day it was moved." The love that built these solid walls at St. John's bolsters them to this day. Many are the organizations, societies, and businesses that have come and gone in our village over the decades. A centennial is a grand occasion, a princely moment in time to look back upon after 100 years of success. May those walls that house the St. John's family be a part of Mokena for another century to come.
To talk about the old church building a little bit, I thought it was really interesting. And you had you wrote a piece for the Messenger on that house specifically,
Yes.
didn't you?
Yes, I did. Yes, indeed.
So that might be something that we go through, because I remember reading it in the Messenger and just thinking how interesting it was. And
it really is.
It's amazing now to look at it after I read this and see, like, you can just see that was a church building.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And it's a beautiful house now, and the people that live there now, really interesting. And they were right when they said it probably had 62 years or more to go, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, it's still standing just as good as the day it was built and moved. So, yeah, it's still trucking.
And it was originally a duplex, you said, right?
Yes. I'm not sure what the situation there is nowadays, but even when I was growing up, it was still a duplex. There were two different families that lived there. And I've actually been in that house once. And it's interesting because if you go inside, especially up on the second floor, you can see, hopefully I'm describing this well enough, but the sort of like the rounded ceiling that goes down into the walls. It definitely looks like something you'd see in a church. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's really cool.
So the new building was dedicated April 15th, 1923.
Yes, that is correct.
And I loved the quote in the article. It said, the news bulletin that said, the most important event which has ever taken place in the village of Mokena, either in church circles or in civic life.
Yeah.
So what's your take on that? Like, why do you think that's true?
I think it's just because, well, back in those days, of course, church meant more to people than that it does now. Not that everybody in the village belonged to a church or was involved with the church, but probably a good number of them were. And St. John's was the biggest congregation in town at the time. Not including, when we look at St. Mary's was here then, the Methodist Church was here, Emmanuel Lutheran was here. St. John's was the biggest, and for them to have had this huge accomplishment of raising all that money in the early 20s and then pulling off building this massive, wonderful building, there really was nothing that would equal that at that time in the village's history. And honestly, when I look back at everything that's happened since then up to this day, I don't know. Maybe it still holds that record. We've had a lot of big constructions over the years, but it wasn't just a big building. It was also something that meant so much to so many people and played such a huge part in so many lives over the years. Yeah.
What would you think of in town that's been around? Yeah, it's definitely one of the most significant buildings in town.
Yeah. Oh, sure.
And so we said the total cost was $60,000. So looked at it, that worked out to be roughly $1,060,000 and some change.
Yeah.
For a town of 500, let alone a church membership of 170.
Yeah, right.
I think it just shows like this was a community church. This was built by the community. And that really everybody played a part in raising money and building this building.
Yeah, it was a real community effort.
And looking back at the book that you wrote, I just loved the photo. And anybody, if you want to get Matt's book, check with St. John's Church and see. They might still have some copies left.
Yeah.
But there's a picture in the back that shows, I believe it's on the dedication.
I believe so. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. 1923. And just an amazing picture.
It is. Yeah, it really is.
So that's a great picture. I love that.
Picturesque.
Check that out.
Yeah, it's a great one. It's one of my favorites, actually.
And the other thing I think of now with St. John's is, hearing the bells, still in the morning. I don't know if that's the still the old bell, or is it an electronic bell now?
Well, that's a good question, and it's something I've actually wondered about myself. That it is a manual physical bell that rings up there.
Okay.
And there is someone who physically rings the bell. There's a big rope that hangs out of the ceiling, and there's a ladder that goes up to the belfry. Whether or not that bell is the original 1862 bell, that I'm not sure. In any case, though, the bell that is up there has been around for a very, very long time. It wouldn't surprise me if it was still the original bell up there. I kind of hope it is.
And have you been up in the bell tower?
I have not. And the reason for that is you have to climb kind of a tall ladder to get up there. And I am a little afraid of heights.
Okay.
But people I know in the church are still trying to get me to go up there. And I think they're convincing me, because I'm starting to, I think, put that stuff behind me, because I really do want to go up there.
And you mentioned it's one of the highest points in the village, correct?
Yeah, it's up there. Yeah. It I think the village water towers are taller.
Sure.
But I mean, it's one of the tallest points in the village. Yeah.
Well, that's great. I thank you for sharing this, Matt. This
You're
is
welcome.
A great book. Like I said,
thanks for having me.
If anybody's interested in getting one of these, check with St. John's, and they can probably direct you in the right direction.
Sure.
So thanks, Matt. Thank you for being here. And,
absolutely.
Look forward to do more.
We hope you enjoyed learning about St. John's Church in Mokena. On our next episode, I get to sit down with Mr. David Kropp, who is the grandson of Reverend William Kreis, as well as the cousin to Laverne and Edwin Yunker of the Yunker Farm. He's been a member of St. John since before he was born. If you enjoy our podcast, please share it with your friends and your family and your neighbors, and please subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen. Being November, we want to remember to honor all of our veterans. Thank you for your service, as well as say Happy Thanksgiving. So thank you for joining us on Mokena's Front Porch, and we'll see you next time.